Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Today I'm speaking with Ryan Bennett. Ryan is a software developer, and I saw him on one podcast talking about the intellectual dark web, but talking about it more as a protocol or as a means to achieve communication as opposed to a loose group of people. And I think the first time I'd heard about you was right after that big Pangburn event in New
Yeah.
York, where you and a couple of mutual friends, Jay Shapiro and I think Melissa Chen, kind of organized a
Yep.
bunch of events for the people who were going.
Yep. Yeah, that was a fun weekend with a lot of awesome cooperation, and I hadn't met any of those folks beforehand. It was just sort of Twitter kismet. And we started, threw up an Eventbrite page, and people started reaching out to their networks, and it was really rewarding.
Yeah, I mean, well, Jay and Melissa, I like quite a bit. They're good
Yeah.
people. But okay, I want to get back to like when you were talking about the protocol. Like you'd come up, so you and Andrea had spoken, and you were going through it, and you'd listed like the four steps of how to
Yeah.
engage a conversation, and you were using it. Um, so I mean, like I have an I you do software design. I was doing like network engineering and setting up communication systems for the military in war zones. In the last 4 years, I've been managing an ISP up in northern Canada. So
Right.
like I was like understanding that from like a hardware end of things, right? And
Right.
so I was thinking if you could just list those four steps again, because
Yeah.
I listened to your thing with Andrea, but I think there might be a initial thing you're missing, and I
Okay.
just want to go through them again just to make sure I'm not, like just repeating something you've already said.
Sure. Well, it might help to take maybe one step back to frame, sort of where the motivation comes from to talk with this metaphor in the first place, right? So I started playing with the idea really the instant that I heard Eric Weinstein utter the term on that live podcast with Sam Harris. Because I heard that, and being a software guy, and sort of playing in a lot of the peer-to-peer and distributed system space, I was like, I'm aware with the underlying technology of the actual dark web, like the onion router, that provides anonymity online. So the metaphor really instantly sort of lit up my imagination, and I started thinking about it as from a network perspective almost immediately. And I started to get really frustrated, especially after Barry Weiss's piece came out, which no bad thoughts on that piece specifically, but the general conversation over the last year and a half has been sort of, you say intellectual dark web, and then you start either praising or critiquing one or two people that have been associated with that label. And I feel like that that framing misses a lot of the potential of the idea of an alternative sort of emergent sense making network that contains both high profile public intellectuals, but it also includes the the people in each of our lives that we're able to have sort of beyond the Overton window discussions with, the people that we can trust to try out new ideas with, who aren't going to
If
like
I could
immediately try and
if,
pigeonhole us.
if I could just interrupt you for a second, just because I wanted to just get back quickly to one thing, like that podcast you'd mentioned when Eric coined the phrase, so to speak, and then when that article came out, the first thing I thought of was that's the worst thing they could have done, or the timing was like way off because
Mm,
the the minute you gave it a name, you gave people something to attack because
right,
right away it was thought of as a group of people, and this is their bent, and this is what they're this is their
right,
bias, this is what they're going to push, right? If you just stayed a loose collection of people who supported each other, or whatever, you could have gone on those speaking tours, you could have done whatever, but not just given that a name. I think the naming was a problem in and of itself.
yeah. I am sympathetic to that point. I don't have as much of a problem, like, because at a certain juncture, if you're going to talk about a phenomenon, you sort of have to name it, right?
Yeah.
You can only dance around something so long. So even if it's a placeholder, um, it's sort of a necessary thing to do. My problem came soon after, when it became clear that the meme was galvanizing in the public consciousness as that sort of club of a dozen people, because I feel like it's it's sort of, it's the perfect name for the emergent phenomenon of a sort of cultural zeitgeist, and it's not that great a name for a club of a few dozen people, at least from where I'm standing.
Yeah. Anyways, if you want to
Yeah.
continue, sorry about that. Sorry for that
Oh,
little
sure.
tangent.
Oh, no, that's fine. So yeah, I guess so. I started thinking about, you know, if you if you have this network, right? What's the proper way to analyze a network? Well, you can identify the nodes that are a part of it, either machines in the case of a computer network, or the people in the case of a social network. And that gets you a little bit, but it's not at the heart of it, because when you think of, what is the internet, it's not just a bunch of computers, right? And what's more is that if you start digging into the ideologies and the arguments of people in the IDW, it's a little like trying to understand the internet by, like, taking a sample of hard drive contents of, connected computers. It's sort of the wrong level of analysis to understand the emergent phenomenon. And to my mind, the right level of analysis to understand that emergent phenomenon is in the protocol that in the case of the internet, those machines use to talk to each other, or in the case of uh, the emergent IDW, would be sort of the conversation protocol that they're using to have high quality discourse in a media environment that is sort of sadly awash with really rather low quality discourse. So that was sort of my initial framing, and so now we're sort of up to date. I can run through the list of one slice of the protocol that I've tried to articulate, for better or worse. It's probably worth noting that a single protocol will never do it, right? Even in technology, we have this notion of a protocol stack, right? Which
Yeah. Yeah. No.
you've got different abstractions that are responsible for different parts of the communications. You've got physical layer, and I'm sure you're aware of all of this given your background, but
Yeah.
perhaps for your audience, you've got the physical layer, which is really just responsible for how do you turn ones and zeros into radio waves that go over Wi-Fi, or into electrical pulses that go over an Ethernet cable. And then at sort of a higher level of abstraction, you have the IP layer, which is all about addressing different machines. So it's how can my computer talk to the computer at the data center that hosts my Facebook profile. And then all the way at the top, you have stuff like HTTP, which which is a little bit more semantic, and it dictates how you encode a request and a response for a specific page, and then, like, how you parse the resulting data. So this IDW handshake that I've nicknamed is really just one attempt to sort of take a microscope and zoom into one layer of what a social or a discursive protocol might look like. And in reverse engineering sort of all the podcasts that I've been listening to, and all these conversations that have been being had with the IDW folks, I identified what I think are sort of four key bootstrapping mechanisms, or bootstrapping steps, that sort of establish that both people are involved in a conversation, are involved in good faith, and are sort of competent to have the level of conversation that you want to have. So those four steps are, first, to really define and distinguish your core terms. The best example of this that people are probably familiar with is the truth debacle between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, right?
Yeah.
So they famously, spent an hour and a half, 2 hours of their first interaction getting wrapped around the axle on the definition of the word true. And it wasn't really until sort of several conversations later that they were able to sort of, and with Brett Weinstein's help, make that distinction between literal truth or objective truth and metaphorical truth. And by creating those two labels for what each one of them were talking about, then they could at least know which of them we're talking about at any given moment and move on with a productive conversation. And I think I put this first because it really, I tend, if I can use another tech metaphor, I tend to think of language as sort of a lossy compression algorithm, like an MP3, right? You're flapping your gums and putting a word over into somebody else's ear, and then it's going to reinflate to some idea, and it loses fidelity in that. But it's also worse than that because it's also non-deterministic, right? If I say a word, like my favorite example is racism, right? If I say racism, if I talk to one type of person, they're going to inflate that as personal prejudice based on skin color. And if I say that to another sort of person, they're going to inflate that in their head as privilege plus power. They're going to have a more systemic definition.
Yeah.
And it's probably worth discussing both of those, but you really need to be clear up front about which one you're talking about. And I think, for most of our history, we've sort of existed in small enough groups that like those definitions were relatively stable. So we didn't, if you're in your small town or your village, or going back even earlier, your tribe, right? And all the people around you have common experiences. The tightness to which your language is self-consistent, so which you can basically take for granted that if you use a word, the person that's hearing it is going to reinflate it to more or less the same idea that was in your head. In the current environment that we're seeing, with a global conversation taking place over social media, that's not really something that we can take for granted anymore. You even see it across disciplines in the academy.
But I think definitions kind of went out the window, and Bill Clinton didn't know what the meaning of the word is.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's not so much that he didn't know, it's that he was actually the case with that is kind of interesting because he sort of weaponized a fine distinction for the purpose of deceit, almost.
Yeah.
At least is my reading. So it's he knew too well, and he was so careful as to make the distinction that he could weasel his way out of something there.
Oh yeah, I know, but I mean it's ridiculous when you get down to that. But no, I mean I agree with you. Like with the definitions, it's because, and I think maybe this is like what I was trying to get at, and I'll let you finish the list. I think it's sort of wrapped up in what you're talking about with the definitions, but I think something needs to happen a little bit sooner. But yeah, I mean, with the racism thing, or I mean, okay, now we're having something like, because I'm ex-Muslim, and I read a lot of this stuff. Like they came out with a definition of Islamophobia in the UK, and they're trying to come out with one in Canada, and it's like redefining words. Or I understand words change, I understand language changes and all that, but it takes time, and it's like it just seems like it just, okay, you know what? We're going to redefine this word now. This is how everyone has to use it, or we're going to come up with this word, and it just.
Well, so that's a sort of I guess a precondition that might be implied in what I'm going after, but not explicitly stated, which is that it is unacceptable to have the authoritarian stance, where you try to enforce a definition of a word. Now, if someone is playing so fast and loose that they're incomprehensible, you don't have to waste your time talking to that individual. Um, but there needs to be some amount of charity given, and this is why the second half of that is definitions and distinctions, right? If I use racism and you have a different definition, then everybody swallow your pride and stick an adjective in front of each usage of that word, and just for the rest of the conversation use that adjective, because you're trying to get over a conversational hurdle of misunderstanding. And if you're trying to enforce a definition, then you're effectively erasing or or preventing your conversation partner from using a tool to explore a content that might be relevant to the conversation, right? So my thing is always, if I want to be as charitable as possible, I'll say, okay, I'll accept your definition of the word that I just tried to use, but in return, tell me what word I should use to reference this thing that I'm very clearly trying to talk about, right? And if they won't do that, then that's a like an instant roadblock.
Okay.
Does that touch on your?
Okay. I mean, okay. Maybe I'll just okay, because what I was thinking was, because you mentioned, what are the principles these people look at, but I think that's number 3 on your list. But my first thing was, okay, and around the same time as all this, when Sam Harris used to talk about the narrative, and he was using it disparagingly, right? So the narrative around any given narrative, and that's the only way you could talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
But then with all this thing like racism is privilege plus power, all that kind of stuff coming out, I said, okay, it's time to have a conversation. So you sit down with your group or yourself or whatever and figure out what your first principles are and what you mean by them, and truly figure it out. Like, you can listen to Jordan Peterson and come back and parrot what he says, and you have no understanding of what you're saying,
right?
Or Sam Harris or anyone. It doesn't have. But
oh yeah,
if you're not,
you can. I like to say, you should vary your flavors of Kool-Aid that you're drinking and try and make your own. Because it seems like
But I mean,
which is not to disparage any given thinker, but you don't want to just become a parrot of them.
Exactly. I mean, but at the same time, you can just say you're for free speech, but you don't really know what you mean, right? It just doesn't mean flapping your gums. There's a lot more to it, and like the abortion debate, like with what's going on in the States right now, the rights of the individual. So I mean, you can argue, you can make a case for rights of the individual that doesn't touch, and I'm not talking about just the abortion case, but if you're arguing for the rights of the individual and someone tries to bring in abortion, you can use that as an example of individual rights, but you can't mire the debate on individual rights into a debate about abortion. Right. So that's what I'm saying. I don't think enough people are sitting back and thinking of what their own first principles are.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think if you can, before you start defining terms amongst each other, if you can sit down and say, okay, you know what? These are my core foundational principles. This is what I believe in. This is, basically this is the lens I'm going to use to solve any problems. And it's at that point, then you so getting back to an IT thing, back in the old Novell days, when you had IPX as opposed to IP, you needed a translator in the middle of them to get them to work. If you don't know where the other person's coming from, and the definitions and all that can help, but you still don't know what lens they're using to answer.
Yeah.
And, find a solution. I mean, and it's.
So this is. Can I jump in? I think I agree with you. I think on the sort of primacy of the type of conversation that you're describing, where you really dig in deep and say, what are the first principles that we're talking about? In my sort of framing, we were talking about the protocol stack earlier for different levels of abstraction. I would view that as a higher level in the stack, right? So the definitions and distinctions, like that's literally, this is how you get ones and zeros over the wire. And then the, the first principles and starting to get into the substance of a real argument. And I'm probably shooting myself in the foot for the other three items in the list now. So I guess I'll try and improve this in real time. But that's why I like talking about this stuff. But I think the being able to understand, and I mean not understanding, not in sort of a lovey-dovey moralistic sense, but just raw comprehension, being able to comprehend what is going on inside of the mind of someone that you're talking to. There's a first principle aspect to that in terms of how they approach different debates. So I'd say that that's important there, but I'd say I still think you need to define things first. Let me see if I can back up this intuition. So for the freedom of speech thing, right? It's obvious that no one's actually a free speech absolutist, right? Because there are, I mean, the canonical example would be child exploitation and child pornography, right? Like nobody wants that to be out in the world. So obviously every term that we use comes with a larger definition around it. So you say free speech, well, that's generally a proxy for argumentation about public policy. It's really like that's sort of the domain where that plays, right? It's not an absolute about any information should go anywhere any of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I use it. I think the First Amendment. I wish we had something like that in Canada, but I think that's the best. That's the best compromise you can have to have about as absolute free speech as possible. You know,
Right.
up until the point where it's an imminent and immediate threat of danger, and yeah, I mean, and child pornography, you're putting someone in danger. So I mean, it covers opinion, and
Right.
it should cover opinion, and it should cover discourse and investigation, but it shouldn't, so if you're doing scientific research, or if you're doing, research in like sociology, or, like soft sciences, whatever you want to call them, like if you're doing anything like that, you need that freedom to voice opinions and ask dangerous questions.
Right. But so if I can maybe attempt a mini Steelman of maybe a more restrictionist approach. We're living in a communicative environment that is unprecedented right now, right? And it's easy to laugh or to maybe just disregard stuff like the Data and Society report that talks about like radicalizing to the alt-right, because I think that is a bit overblown. But maybe the thing that would be a bit more sympathetic to worry about is something like anti-vaxxers, right? Like if there's a public health concern that's going on for misinformation or bad opinion, it's sort of I realize the more and more I think about these things is that like a lot of these problems, that it boils down to like tragedy of the commons sort of situations where the influence of ideology has a second or third or fourth order effect in the world somewhere that does result in harm. And it's really easy to draw the bright line at the speech act that is inciting violence, because it's the domino right before the act of harm, right? But zooming out and looking at the way mimetic contagion happens and ideology spread, it seems to me that there is an argument to be made that you could back up that chain of events and say, okay, we need something akin to a mimetic immune system, so that we don't, you know, start a civil war, or we don't um, get the information for how to bring back smallpox in the hands of a domestic terrorist or something along those lines. Sorry, I kind of went way into left
No,
field
that's
there, so
fine. I
feel
mean,
free
like,
to bring me back.
no, but okay, I don't mind going down this because it's something. I mean, we can whatever we can come back. But yeah, like okay, so the how you're saying we're highly communicative, and like you put out a tweet about the algorithms in Google, and I because and, and
Yeah,
that's just it. Like I think because we're highly communicative, and because there is that much information out there, if you start curtailing speech, the, I have no respect for anti-vaxxers. I think they're doing a horrible disservice to the world.
oh, absolutely.
But
And oh,
I go
you
along the
finish.
line. Yeah, sorry, I go along the lines of, um, you know, you have to counter it with better arguments, but also I don't think like I'm pushing 50. You know,
Okay.
they taught us how to use the library, how to do research. I don't think anyone's learning how to do research off the web properly, and I don't think the algorithms are helping. Um,
Right.
it, if Google was designed like a library, so if you opened up Google and you had a bunch of tabs on there, and it was fiction, history, blah blah blah, and
Yeah.
they gave it you know use the Library of Congress classifications of what is historical fiction, what's real history, what's that, and so if people did a Google search, all those tabs would be filled, and if you wanted historical fiction, you could put up the Civil War and go to the fiction section and read novels about the Civil War, but you know what you're getting.
Right.
And if like again, I miss going to, and not that they're disappeared or anything, but going into a library or going to a bookstore and walking through the stacks of books and just finding a book at random and picking it up.
Hmm.
Google doesn't give you that. YouTube doesn't give you, like, it's you're beholden to those algorithms. And if you were doing a deep dive, let's just say looking into anti-vaxxers for 2 weeks, then on, you might just get anti-vax bullshit in your feeds.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting because so I've noticed this about Twitter recently, is that when I first started using Twitter, I've had an account for a while, but it was only probably maybe a year or two ago that I used it as a way to get off Facebook. So we can make your own judgments whether the cure is worse than the disease there. But what I found was that at the outset, it's like before the algorithm gets to know you or gets to think that it knows you, you kind of do have that experience of walking down the shelves and picking a random book off. But it's like the security camera at the library sees you pull that book down and skim through it, and then some gremlins show up and swap out the next shelf so that as you continue walking, then it's all copies of books like that. So I've been trying to find a way to sort of consciously notice when I'm seeing a lot of the same sort of stuff pop up, and it's almost like a weekly project where I'm like, oh, I went on this tear about this subject this week, and now I'm getting all of that sort of content. So I've got to make a conscious effort to go plant some new seeds to get the algorithm to like knock itself out of this local optimization, because it thinks it's figured out the only thing that I care about.
Yeah, but I mean, like I said, I don't want to get too much into the weeds on the speech issue. I mean, we could. It's something I'm like love talking about, but
Sure.
it's that's okay. So you're actively making a conscious effort to do that. Not
Right.
everyone does, and not everyone knows enough to, right?
Sure.
Especially like my friends, like my mom or my aunts and stuff like that. They wouldn't have the wherewithal to do that.
Right.
And so and I don't know about the, like, everyone's like, oh, the younger generations, they're so tech savvy. They're tech savvy in the way that they can pick up a phone and, upload videos and this and that and do whatever they want, but they don't
Yeah.
know how it works. And like,
Yeah. So I I'm a really big fan of the metaphor of literacy, uh, and the terms digital literacy and digital like fluency,
mm,
um, for lack of a better term. And the distinction between those two is, I think, really important, because you could put them both under the umbrella of tech savvy, but it's a lot like, people say that kids these days are digitally illiterate. I don't think they are. I think they're digitally fluent. To make an analogy between being a fluent speaker of a language versus actually being able to read and write,
yeah,
um, because speaking and listening, comes, you know, almost basically second nature to every human being, right? If you're immersed in a linguistic upbringing, you will figure out language, and how to speak it and how to listen to it. The same is not at all true of the of true literacy, of being able to read and write. So I think we need to recognize that gap, um, and recognize that, yes, kids are being immersed in this digital realm and they're digitally fluent, right? They can open their TikTok or Instagram or whatever next week's killer app is, and they can use it and they can interact in it, and use it to communicate with each other. But they don't know enough about the infrastructure that they find themselves embedded within, um, to actually constitute what I would really call digital literacy. Do you think that
yeah,
distinction makes sense?
no, that makes perfect sense. I mean, and that's that's basically it, and that's why I'm saying that get better, get better education. I don't have kids, so maybe I'm speaking about something I don't know enough about. But they should, you know spend time saying, okay, when you do a Google search, like like I said, in
This is
English
what's
class,
happening in the
yeah,
background, or
yeah,
in the background.
yeah, and then or exactly, or this is how you get your answers. This is how you should do research on it, and so uh, they get some of that literacy, right? They know,
Right.
they know what they're getting. They know that you're not always going to get what you want. And again, I think that's why maybe the tech companies have to do some. They have to be a little bit better. I mean, I use the analogy that with all the terms of service and they can kick you off their platform, or whatever. They're kind of like landlords, and I'm saying they should be more like librarians,
Yeah.
because
Well, so my mother is actually a reference librarian, so I'm all for that. I've yeah, most respect for that profession. Um,
but I mean, like Google especially. I mean, Twitter and Facebook, whatever. But Google is our store of information, and it is
yeah.
where most people will go now, to get quick information instead of going to a library. And so it should
Right.
be curated like one.
Yeah, and it's also the maybe this is not quite implied by the library, but we associate libraries as public goods, right? They're typically run
But
by governmental entities, and you know, I it's a coin toss which institutions I'm more disappointed and frustrated with, governmental ones or corporate ones at any given moment. You know, it's uh, it's sort of house choice, um, but it seems to me that there needs to be a way of creating that knowledge store in a way that's serving as a public good. Um, and it's I don't think we can trust companies like Google, and I'm sure we shouldn't be trusting an institution like the federal government. Um, which and this sort of train of thought is why I've spent my entire tech career, sort of obsessing about peer-to-peer systems, and distributed and decentralized systems. It's because it seems like everything has to be not purely like democratic, not like some sort of simple majority vote system, but there needs to be an emergent negotiation that's happening about how we are valuing different pieces of information, how we're vetting them for accuracy, and for relevance. And I think a lot there's my if I had a desire in that space, it would be to see something created that performed the social utility of Google. Because I mean, Google has immense social utility, right? If you need a piece of information and you know what you're looking for, to be able to find that in 10 seconds is just
it's phenomenal.
Out of this world, and we want to keep that, right? The problem is that it's been co-opted and controlled by a single entity that has very specific interests that are, you know, most of the time indifferent to our interests as users, and a non-zero portion of the time it seems reasonable to assume that they are actually counter to the interests of the user, and that's where we really get into trouble.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean that's just it. Like it was a good little tangent, but we get back to the rest of your list there.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, sure. Oh, no worries. This has been good. So yeah, we started with definitions and distinctions. I think the second item there was to execute a steel man of your partner's position. And this is, you see this, it's almost become a cliche in the sort of IDW greater community, that, steel man is invoked all the time. So I don't think we need to go into deep dive on that, but it seems obvious that that's an early step that needs to happen, because if you're going to disagree with someone on the finer point, you really need to be able to articulate what their position is that you're disagreeing with. That seems almost self-evident, but sometimes I guess it's not, or rather, I don't think it's even so much that it's not self-evident. I think just in the heat of the moment, we forget to take the slow and steady route to a good conversation.
Or you think you have an aha moment and you're like, there, I got you.
Right. So, and that's it feels silly going through this list every time I say it out loud, because I feel kind of pretentious going through it at all, because it all seems sort of like no-brainers. Like, yeah, didn't we just learn that this is a good things to do in a conversation? But the way I've been thinking of it is just like a mental checklist for myself to like be reminded of, like, oh wait, I skipped that, and I think maybe there's some utility in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something to be, obviously it's not, when you're sitting around with your friends just shooting the shit, it's not that important, but if you're actually trying to have a meaningful discussion, maybe it's something to have always in the back of your mind, so you can, am I being unfair to the person I'm discussing with?
Right. And especially when you're in a high stakes discussion or in a high tension discussion, right? Those are the moments where you revert to impulse. So there might be a utility in, practicing with your friends while you're hanging around shooting the shit of going through these things rigorously and formally, so that you sort of develop a psychological muscle memory, so that even when the chips are down and it's a tense situation or a high stakes conversation, you can still have the presence of mind to be methodical about it. But yeah, so define and distinguish your terms, steelman your partner's position, and then the third one, and this tends to throw people for a loop, but I call it agreeing upon the disagreement, which is different from agreeing to disagree, right? Because agreeing to disagree is to say, okay, well, I'm not going to convince you, you're not going to convince me. Let's go our separate ways and try and maintain the peace in the short term. Which there's probably a space for that, but I think if you want to push through it, you need to you basically take the intersection of the two steel men that you just created with your conversation partner, and you say, okay, are these steel men actually in battle against each other? And if so, where are they hitting each other? What is the actual slice of our worldview that is in conflict here? And if you've done the work, if presumably you understand your own position, and you've demonstrated to each other that you understand each other's position, you should be able to converge, not on what the resolution to the disagreement is, but you should at least be able to converge on what the substance of the disagreement is. And it's so, I see this, it's just everywhere in the public conversation right now. You see people talking past each other on these issues like racism or abortion or Second Amendment rights. You name the political wedge, and there's the points that are being used don't address the actual concerns of the other side. So I think it's important to take a step back and really say, okay, even if we don't agree at the end, we agree about what we disagree about.
Yeah. Okay. Case in point recently was the concentration camp thing with Cortez, and It's like, okay, at what point doesn't it matter that, okay, get the kids some clothes, some soap, get them cleaned up, get them fed, get them looked after, then we can have the discussion about concentration camps or not?
Right. The rhetorical device, to call it them concentration camps, is obfuscating the actual problem, right? Because people are now, you can make the argument that the use of the rhetorical device raised the public consciousness about the actual problem, and I think there's probably something there. But at the end of the day, I don't. It's the same definition of distinction thing. Yeah, I don't give a damn. Just treat these people humanely.
Exactly, but that's just it. I mean, like, okay, when she said concentration camps, right?
Yeah.
It raised some awareness by some people, but more of the awareness got raised by the people who were freaking out about it. I'm like saying the people who were freaking out about it, right?
Right.
At that point, okay, you know what? That what she called them is such a small thing compared to what's happening to those kids. And I mean, I don't particularly agree with the term, but I don't even want to, like, I don't want to have that, like, I'm dreading bringing the
opportunity cost to having that particular pissing contest,
and then there's an opportunity cost to having what we're doing right now about it. Like, not that either of us can fix anything about this, but we're talking about the futility of having that conversation. And how futile is this conversation? And and that's where I was thinking, like, if you knew exactly what her first principles were, if you knew exactly what lens she used, but to look at issues, then maybe you'll know where she's coming from with concentration camp, and then you could forget that for the instant and then focus on helping the kids who are there first.
Right. And I think that would, the way I would come at that would be sort of that's a emergent out of the steel manning process, right?
Okay.
Is that you try and get inside that person's head, and even if you don't agree with that position, you try and articulate just the best possible version. It might not be a one-to-one mapping with what you're after, but I do think that through these steps, the first principle awareness does come to light. Now, I do want to address, because you made an interesting point, and I think this is something that comes up a lot when people when someone who's very passionate about something comes across someone who's rather dispassionate and trying to be, almost nuanced to a fault about a subject. That accusation of, like, okay, well, what's the opportunity cost of you having this banal conversation? Well, things in the world need to change, and my general response to that is that, well, it's twofold. One is that, realistically speaking, uh, us having this conversation is pretty much the only thing we can do about it. Um, so there's with all the information and news that we're consuming, very little of what we hear about or read about or watch, um, that we think of as news, constitutes actionable intelligence for our lives. We can be as outraged about something as we want, or as saddened by something that we want, but um, the times are rare where there's much more we can do than uh, than maybe call our congressperson, or something that is a sort of drop in the bucket of a PR campaign. Now, alternatively, what we can do is have, like, as social animals, we're going to have conversations with the people that we're connected to in our lives, whether they're over social media or face to face, right? So I think the project of unilaterally trying to improve the quality of those conversations, to the extent that you've got a good idea that maybe you don't have the immediate ability to implement in the world, um, the effectiveness with which you can both receive criticism to that idea and thereby improve it, and also communicate it to audiences, and not even audiences, but just other individuals. I think the long-term effects of doing that far outweigh, any sort of gut thing that you could do, um, with that amount of time, by signing some web petition, or calling your congressperson.
Okay, no,
Um,
I don't disagree with what you're saying there. But so, I don't want to focus on this, but it was just such a good example of it. So she puts out the tweet saying concentration camps. So if you're outraged about what's happening, if you're just outraged about her calling them concentration camps, whatever. It's like you're saying, okay, I'm going to give up my hands, and because you're not looking for a solution about what the real problem is. You're focused on something else. But if you're actually outraged about what's happening to those kids, instead of saying, okay, she shouldn't have called them concentration camps, or yes, she should have, this is what they're doing, just, okay, you know what? These kids need help. Let's do something to get, okay, and put out that kind of information, or that kind of message.
right.
And
Start
even though it's
and send them some goddamn soap.
yeah, okay, and it's you're the average person doing it. Yes, we're just a drop in the bucket, but it's one less screeching lunatic, and it's one small thing that's getting done. And if all the outrage, if 50% of the outrage about the comment went to things like that, maybe those kids might have gotten a little bit of help a little bit quicker. I don't know.
Yeah, well, no, I think it's, you sort of, everyone's got access to a different set of levers in the world, right? And some of them are longer levers, so you can move more with them. Some of them are shorter, and they're all spread out across different domains. So I guess my point is more on the really abstract conversation that we're having about sort of the handshake idea. Just that it's easy to, I give myself this criticism. There's like a voice in the back of my head that says, Ryan, you're just navel gazing with all of this stuff, right? It's not really important. But I do think that the meta conversations are worth having, insofar as they improve the quality of the other conversation.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I get it. I mean,
yeah.
no, I get it. Like and that's, I'll just give you, because I you might hear, I get frustrated. I was overseas until 2014. Okay. I left in 2002, so I was gone for almost 13 years, and social media wasn't a thing when I was gone.
Right.
And I was working on military bases in active war zones, so your access to social media was curtailed because they didn't want some guy posting a picture and giving something away, right?
Sure.
So I got back to the start of this insanity. Like, I mean, it really started
Right.
bubbling up around that time. And since that point, I was thinking, like, okay, there's something gone completely wrong here. Like, it's, what's happened? In 13 years, like, what the hell happened?
Right.
And for me, it came to a complete head where I said, okay, this is, and I was guilty of everything I was thinking at this point. This went back to Christmas of 2017, and there was someone online. I don't even want to mention their name. I don't want to mention anyone's names or anything like that. And it's not someone I respect. I do not like this person. But they had said something along the lines of believe all victims. And then someone said, blah, 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 so-and-so raped me, believe me. And then there was a little bit of kerfuffle about that. Then that went away. And then someone famous tweeted a screen cap of that. And then the person involved went off Twitter. And people I follow, people who are friends of mine, also don't like this guy. And some of them were gleeful that he took his account off Twitter because of a joke. Now, this person didn't end up taking their account off Twitter, came back after a month or so. But the fact that we thought it was plausible that someone would delete their account because of harm that was going to come to them from something that everyone knew was a lie and a joke.
Right.
Like I'm saying, if we've gotten to that point where that's in the realm of possibility, then everything's screwed. And we need to change the way we're talking, and we certainly need to change the things we're focusing on.
Right. All right. And this is why I've found myself having less and less. This is perhaps a non sequitur, but maybe it'll be good. I've found myself having less and less of a tolerance for sarcasm as a means to humor, because it really is only about galvanizing an in-group, that type of humor, because the people who get the joke are already, or who are listening to the joke, are already on your side, and the people that you would nominally say you're trying to prove wrong are just going to get pissed off about it, right? It's just it's probably the least. It is the most. It's the most effective way to further solidify your membership within an in-group, and it is probably the most detrimental speech act, sort of everyday speech act, in terms of the overall coherence of civil discourse in general, right? Because it just chips away at any sort of goodwill and trust. I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, okay, sarcasm is low-hanging fruit, but I mean, if you follow my Twitter, majority of what I do, and it's only with people I know, like I don't just random people. It's snarky comments. So yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, there's, but I think that's the in-group version of it, right? And there's something to be said about friendly banter between people who know that they're on the level with each other. But when you, like, I mean, it's basically, it's deploying the straw man in a mocking fashion in a public debate or altercation. That's sort of what I'm going after.
Yeah, okay. If you're having a serious conversation with someone, and and even if it's someone who's you consider a friend, if you're trying to go through something serious, snark and sarcasm doesn't really have a place in that. I mean,
right.
It is low hanging fruit, and it is. I mean,
right. But it's like quote tweeting.
Yeah.
You find some position, somebody saying something that you don't disagree with, and you quote tweet it with some clever, snarky, dunk and to your followers, and you probably invite there's a tacit invitation for a pile-on if you've got enough of a platform. There's these emergent phenomenons that cause breakdown there that I think are, because all of those dunks, I mean, to my mind, basically what you're doing there is you're just trying to you're trying to get your next fix of the
Dopamine,
notification
yeah.
button.
And I mean, okay, that's one thing I've noticed too, and it's a lot of people who freak out about, oh, look at the mob rules on Twitter, it's the mob is so bad, and they rail about it. But then at the same time, I've seen them, quote tweet someone or take a screenshot and say, oh, I wonder what the ratio is going to be on this one, or they're going to get ratioed really bad. And it's like, you're doing the exact same thing and you're reveling in it.
Right. Yeah. So there's an interesting thing about the quote, and I think it's true why as well. I'm fairly certain it is. But it's something I've called the pushback paradox. And it's that anytime on a social media platform that you engage with content, and specifically in this context, say someone says something and you comment on them to contradict them, that action carries with it a de facto share, because it triggers the social media platform to say that you have engaged with it and that it's engageable material. So now there's a higher likelihood that people that follow you will see your response and also the original comment. So there's this odd scenario where no matter how vehemently you are opposing something in the context of your tweet or your reply or your comment, you are in fact resharing the original thing to which you had issue to. So and I see this all the time. It's like someone who I follow who's got like 20,000 followers will quote tweet some inane statement, commenting like, how can people be this wrong, right? And then I click through and I look at this person and it's like SpongeBob SquarePants with 17 followers. So it's like, okay, yes, what they said was stupid and inane, but you have just amplified it to 10,000, 20,000 people.
Yeah. Okay, just a little aside on this. I can't remember where I heard. I think it might have been Carl Sagan's daughter. It was like an interview about him, I think, and she was talking about how. So let's say someone puts out an anti-vaxxer video, and then you're gonna debunk that, or you're gonna go through it. You actually, it was something weird, like the video debunking actually spreads the message more than the initial message itself.
Yeah, this is I can't remember the details of the study, but I'm familiar with it because it comes up fairly recently. I think it's a pretty well replicated finding, which is that the argument against something, actually, even if you just say like vaccines do not cause autism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a poor example because that debate is so prevalent. But if it were sort of a nothing fact and you just heard it, but you heard it stated in the negative, you will remember it in the positive. It
wasn't even that. It was more. I think it was something along those lines. But it was an old video. It was. I only saw it recently, but I mean, you could tell just by the quality of the, like the film quality and all that. Like it was a late 90s maybe that this thing had come out, or maybe it was a little bit, maybe the early 2000s. So yeah, it wasn't like that recent,
right?
And so yeah, I mean, like I said, it was along those lines though, that hearing someone disprove something, you're actually hearing the thing, and a lot of people will end up believing the thing they're trying to disprove.
Yeah. So I have a suspicion about why that is, and I think you'll be well poised to hear it since you also have the tech background. I think the not operator is just quite simply an extra cognitive step, and so it's the first thing to get dropped in your memory, right? Like you.
Yeah.
So I try and am very rarely successful. Um, but it's interesting to think about if you have that realization, right, that to negate something requires all of the mental energy that it took to affirm the thing plus one more step, and so that and recognize that 6 months down the line, anyone that hears it, there's some percentage of them that are just going to like drop that extra cognitive step because we're human and we have faulty memory.
Yeah.
um, that might say something about an approach in general, when you're trying to espouse something, is to always try and formulate the positive statement. Because you can get creative enough with language, that for most cases, I think that there's a way to phrase something in the affirmative that conveys the exact same meaning as the the negative statement that you're going against. And you might sort of, uh, by doing so, my hope is that you would be generating memes that are sort of more survivable and more robust in the wild. Be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, okay. Look, the if you could, okay, getting back to the vaccines thing. I mean, there in some cases there's just no way to do it. Like vaccines don't cause autism. I mean, I don't know how you could say that in the positive. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, if you can do it, I see where you're coming from. Like, if you can phrase what you're saying, um, like, if you could phrase what you're saying in a way that, uh, I'm trying to think of an example of to give you, like,
Well, so you might not be able to do a pure 180 on the exact substance,
yeah,
but imagine making some sort of positive statements like vaccines are safe,
yeah,
right?
vaccines are safe, or
So you yeah,
vaccines cure disease, or vaccines have been proven, and whatever you.
right. So you don't necessarily have to do a 180 on the precise statement, but if you can come up with a positively phrased statement that is perhaps mutually exclusive with the one that you are trying to negate, and so now you've got two memes that can't really coexist in the same brain, without invoking a lot of cognitive dissonance. That might be, if you can make your affirmative statement strong enough, that it's the one that that gets kept after that cognitive dissonance is resolved. Um, that my intuition is that that's going to be a lot more effective than simply negating the original state.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, again,
I
it's
mean, it may or may not be.
well, no. I mean, I'm just trying to I'm just trying to think this. Like, I mean, I could see that working, but again, it comes down to, are you going to be able to get those ideas out? And I'll go back to the first thing kind of we were talking about, like the free speech. Like, you're putting out those arguments, and you have to be able to put them out. You have to be able to freely give them, but
Yeah,
you have to be able to give them to people who, even if they disagree with you, at least are willing to listen, right?
right.
Like, you need. That's why I'm saying, like, I still don't think if you can get that common framework built
Yeah,
up. Um,
yeah. Well, so I think a lot in terms of filtering, because there's a lot of people on the internet, right? And there's a lot of information, right? And I tend to think of it as a very noisy communicative environment. So if it's probably worth our time to save time by not engaging with people for whom the overhead cost is so high, right? They're not willing to listen to your point, right? They're not willing to extend the same principle of charity to your argument that you're willing to extend to theirs. And given the finite time we all have to engage with one another, um, I think we might be better off in a lot of situations with SpongeBob SquarePants saying something like trolling us. We're better off if we can have a sort of personal litmus test that says, okay, I'm gonna you know I'm gonna give you a shot to engage with me on reasonable terms. And if you don't take it, I'm not wasting any more time with
Yeah, I mean, just because I couldn't be bothered. For the most part, I won't reply. I just don't bother. And okay, it's not like I have thousands upon thousands of followers or anything like that. But and I don't care if the person's got more followers than me or not or whatever, right? I don't care who it is. If I believe that their reply or their comment to me is completely in bad faith, I mean, I'm not even going to bother. And
Oh yeah, but
and
I
I
think
think, I think,
you might be more unique than you realize in that regard.
oh, I was about to say, I think more people should do that because do you really care what SpongeBob SquarePants thinks about you?
Yeah, I, for some reason people do. I, it, it, I mean, maybe we're just wired. We're missing some software module in our
or
psychological makeup.
or
Uh,
maybe, I mean, because it is a network, it is people, but it is also based on algorithms. We
oh
have
yeah, I
a
mean
little bit more of an understanding. Maybe, I don't know.
we're swimming upstream, all of us, in in these environments because they are designed to optimize for keeping us glued to the screen, right? Whichever way they can find to do that. Now, I mean, it's of note that one, there's a variety of ways to do that, and rage is a really effective one, but cute cats are also really effective, right? Um, and there are other emotions that are also being manipulated to maximize our engagement. So, similar to that sort of process of the analogy to walking through the library and picking up a book, and then all of a sudden the books on the next shelf are like that book. Um, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the consequence of the engagement optimization is that, like, if you were in a really bad place for the first month that you signed up on Twitter and you're just in a really shitty mood, and that was the algorithm's first taste of you, and so it maximized your engagement by way of outrage in that first month. You might just get stuck there for the rest of your Twitter experience. Or if you were in, like, if you had just had uh, a kid, or you just bought a puppy or something, really lighthearted, and love emotion based, right? And that's what the algorithm picked up on you, and you just sort of stayed in puppy Twitter. Um, I, I'd be interested to see any data on that. I mean, this is pure speculation.
Okay, what
Um,
wasn't it?
but
Microsoft, their AI within like 24 hours turned into like a raving. Um,
oh yeah,
the,
the Nazi. Well, okay,
yeah,
so that that's a little bit of an edge case,
yeah.
because it was like the news of that immediately like made its way to 4chan, and they were just like, oh yeah, we're turning this robot into a Nazi,
Oh,
because that'll be
okay.
hilarious, right?
I
Like
didn't.
that was,
I didn't know that
yeah,
end of it.
yeah. So that was, if I'm recalling correctly, I could be mistaken, but my understanding is that was a incredibly targeted effort to troll that particular AI.
Okay. Okay. Just sticking with this because this is, and I'm gonna give this caveat. This is pure woo. I don't believe this, and it's just. But I just like it was just some. And I even put it out like I'm saying this is purely conspiratorial. I don't take this seriously. I was like, okay, the social media companies created social media so that the algorithms could figure us out and they could use that data to create their AIs.
Oh yeah. Um, I mean, I like it. I think it'd make a great dystopian uh, sci-fi. And whether or not there was a conscious, you know, roadmap to that plan at the outset, um, I find it completely conceivable that that's what's going to happen yeah, excuse me, opportunistically, right? Now that they've got all the data, they're like, oh yeah, let's shove this into our training model. And I mean, that's sort of what happens with, you know, chatbots, right? They're still very narrow, but I would be very surprised if there wasn't a bit of all of our real human conversations that's going into the training sets for, the chatbot that's going to help you book a airplane ticket or whatnot.
Yeah. But yeah, no, sorry. I mean, kind of derailed a little bit. I don't think you even ever got to your last point there in your list.
Yeah, sure. So you've defined and distinguished terms. You've steel-manned each other's positions. You've agreed upon what the disagreement is. So you both are on the same page about what actual conflict there is between your worldviews. And I think the last thing to do is to set the goalposts, and proactively volunteer the conditions under which you would change your mind. And I think that's really a precondition for getting into any sort of argument or debate.
Yeah, okay. I mean, like that would be like the sync and the acknowledge and like the handshake and all that, and like the 4 steps you go through, and
yeah.
But I mean,
it's important to recognize, right, that this isn't like, here we are for the presidential debates, and for the first opening statements, we're going to go through this handshake thing. It's not. This is where the metaphor to tech really just sort of breaks down, because human to human conversations are so much more fluid. So I think it's more of, I tend to invoke these in real time in conversations that I'm having with people, more as just things to keep in my own mind of like, okay, I'm going to keep in mind when each of these steps is threatening to break down, or when I notice that they haven't occurred yet, and we're in the weeds yelling at each other about XYZ, but we haven't even agreed about what the disagreement is. So let's back up a little bit. So there's sort of a
I mean, I understand what you're saying. Like you have it as a checklist in the back of your mind. It's not like you're going to come up to the first, when you're having a conversation with everyone, okay, well, define racism, define that. But it's just,
right.
If in the course of your conversation, like I've started doing something similar. Let's say, okay, a really quick thing. There's a law in Quebec that just passed where no public employee can wear religious symbols. Right.
Okay.
Now, both the pro and the con to this bill were making it about the hijab. I'm like, okay, you're both wrong. Even though I agree with the con side, you guys are making the wrong argument, and I can't back a wrong argument. And so when I started talking about it, I laid out what I think this thing was affecting, and then I explained how I did it. And that's how I'm trying to make my arguments now. So if I'm against this law, and I said, okay, it's affecting your personal freedoms, affecting religious freedoms. I also said it was affecting, innocence until proven guilty.
Right.
And then I gave my arguments for why I'm doing that. And I think instead of going up and, okay, how do you define this? How do you define that? Like you're saying, it's way too cumbersome to do. But if you keep that in the back of your head as you're making your arguments or your points, you can kind of do it like you're writing an essay where you lay out what you're going to talk about and then give the meat of, your argument there.
Yeah. And you can sort of, if you're aware of them, then you can be on the lookout for when there's a breakdown, right?
Yeah.
If you're aware, like when someone uses a term or you use a term and someone responds to it in a very specific way, a little light bulb can go off and you can be like, wait a minute, maybe when I said that, it didn't inflate into the same thing in their brain. So maybe we should circle back and try and clear up that ground.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like I said, I liked your idea with when I heard you talking about it with Andrea, and I just thought that an initial step, in my mind, I was thinking about it like, okay, I get a new piece of kit, I've never used it, I don't know what it is, and I'm going to get this to make my network work. I need to learn it. So that's why I was trying to think, okay, if you don't know where you're coming from even, So even
Right.
if you're defining terms by, you know, you're quoting Milton to define free speech, or you're quoting Crenshaw because you want to use intersectionality, or
Right.
you're quoting Sam Harris or Peterson or whoever, and you're just quoting what they say, but you haven't truly inspected it for yourself to know what you yourself actually think. I
Right.
don't think you're ever going to be able to have like a truly meaningful conversation, and I don't think you're ever going to maybe truly convince people of your own opinion.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to convince people of a secondhand opinion because it tends to fall apart the second it comes
Yeah.
under any real pressure.
No,
Um,
yeah, totally. But that's what I'm saying. I think the first thing that should be done is you look at yourself,
oh yeah.
and then I mean, if you haven't done that little bit.
Well, you got to boot up the machine before you can initialize a network connection.
Exactly, and
Right.
that's where I was kind of like, that's where I was going with it. Like it's like I've got a new, I've got a new
Yeah. There's
router.
sort of it's almost like it's not even step one. It's sort of step zero.
Yeah,
Right.
it's yeah, exactly. It's the prerequisites you need to have before you can even get to that stage to have that protocol come into effect.
Yeah. I'd buy that.
And like I mean, like I said, that was kind of my little. It wasn't even really a bone of contention.
Right.
I was like, okay, there might be something missing here. And then
No, I
again,
like it.
it was like the little algorithm thing, which was just a tweet you'd put out, and I was like, I've been kind of thinking this to myself, like these tech companies have to do better, and this algorithm has to work better. It shouldn't just give you what you think you want,
Yeah.
because you
Absolutely.
might not know, especially if you're younger, and
Yeah.
it's, I mean, again, you know, the education system, I think they need to spend time teaching kids how to use, like how to do research in this method. I mean, they still might be just saying go to the library, go on the computer, and like I don't think they have card catalogs anymore. It's all computerized. So go on the computer in the library and find the book you need. I don't know if they're giving them the skill set to learn how to, like, I think that's why my most basic thing is always the free speech, and about as
Right.
absolute as possible. It's, you need to get the information, but you need to be able to get to people to learn how to listen to that information, or ingest it,
Yeah.
because that's where the free speech argument
Well, this
is
there.
all about.
Yeah, and I think there's um, it's sort of a rights and responsibilities sort of thing where it's like, yes, you have free speech, and with that comes a bit of a responsibility to articulate things well and to endeavor to use it positive.
Well, I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
and that's with everything. I mean, you have
Yeah.
to, but again, that comes back to teaching. And it's not all school. There's family, and I realize
Yeah.
there's so many
So
issues in there. But
something I might throw at you is similar to that sort of overabundance of people and sort of not learning how to filter out people who are coming at you in bad faith, like learning how to ignore the trolls. I think in that education and media literacy point, there's a deep need for the ability to filter out both bad information, right? And this is just like, you know, the, if I could advocate a mandatory maybe high school class, it would be just, a decent classical reasoning and critical thinking course where you just learn the patterns of bad arguments and learn about logical inconsistencies, and learn about how to construct good arguments, and sort of just training uh, against propaganda, and training against public panics, and learning how to sort of see more clearly not just who you're getting the information from, but the information itself. Like, you should be able to attenuate some of the noise that we're all exposed to. Because I don't think the noise. I don't think there's Maybe that's the best way to put it. I don't think there's a moral way to mandate that there be less static, but there is a moral way to train us all to be better at attenuating that static.
Yeah, I mean, we have to. I mean, we picked up filters for everything else, and I just don't. I think at the pace with which the internet grew, we haven't had time to pick up those filters. I think they're slowly starting to come in, and people are slowly, very slowly, starting to figure it out. But you need to get those things in. I know you've got a hard out here, so thank you very much for your time. I'll give you the last word if you want to give people any information, if you got anything coming up, or if you want to just give out your social media or anything.
Sure. I am at ry underscore nomad. If anyone wants to jump on Twitter, that's pretty much my only personal public presence, such as it is. I do want to point out something, or give a plug to a thing that I've recently come across in my Twitter feed, called the the inter-intellectual sort of sphere. Um, there, there's a series of essays that have gone up recently that are describing this sort of emergent zeitgeist of sort of an intellectual niche in the public sphere. And as I've been reading them and sort of following the Scout and some people having conversations around it, it really strikes me as the thing that I thought the IDW was when I first heard it, right before that meme sort of got deeper into the public consciousness and sort of solidified into this, club of public intellectuals. And I had this sort of notion that it was really this emergent phenomenon of people throughout the world sort of trying to find each other and raising the bar on conversations, and not just being subject to one-size-fits-all narratives. These essays on the II have really spoken to that same philosophy, and sort of I mentioned this with Andrea. I sort of recognize that I've too late to the game, and perhaps just sort of lost the definitional battle for the IDW. I think it is what it is in the public consciousness now. So I should probably take my own advice and swallow my pride and back away from what I'm conceptualizing. But the II really is, I think, what I was going for when I started thinking about this large scale network thing. So if anyone's interested in that, I would highly suggest that you check them out. They're at What's the II, all one word, on Twitter. And I think they've got some pinned tweets about the sort of foundational essays. Really good stuff.
Cool. I'll check that out. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for listening.